Last year at the beginning of summer, I visited my Nana's farm with my mom for just a weekend. Her farm is located in a very rural and secluded area, right at the foot of a mountain in a rural area of South Carolina. The roads in my area are poorly maintained and barely wide enough for two cars to pass by each other. The houses are spread out and pretty far back into the tree line from the road, so there is very little ambient light besides a car's headlights in the distance. So, my mom and I were driving along, her in the driver's seat and me in the passenger. It was around 11 p.m. and we were about 15 minutes away from Nana's, deep in the woods with the radio down, almost silent. We come onto this straight stretch of road in a heavily wooded area, and suddenly, this blur of a creature darts out across the road, right at the edge of our headlights. It was moving incredibly fast, but my mom and I got a really good look at it, and both of us agreed at what we saw. It was a reasonably large creature, roughly the size of a person, maybe just a bit bigger. Neither of us could make out the shape of the head, but we both remember it appearing to have a segmented body, as if it were emaciated and its ribcage were poking out. The reflection of a light made it hard for me to tell the color, but my mom said she remembered it to be dark, and she didn't see any fur or hair. It had long, gangly limbs as it moved across the road. It didn't run the way a dog or a horse would with all four legs. The best word to describe it would be that it was loping, using its front limbs to pull itself along and moving considerably fast. We both said something along the lines of, "What the heck is that?" as it crossed in front of us. As we got up to where it had crossed, I turned to look at it, and as we reached the other side of the road, where it was just out of our headlights, I looked, and I swear on my life, it stood up and it ran. Not like a dog, but like a person, as if it were bipedal. I immediately yelled that it had stood up, and we both started getting nervous. I honestly would have thought that I was going insane had another person in the car not seen it with me. My mom has always been a pretty level-headed person, and not superstitious in any circumstance, but she was incredibly nervous and was pretty scared about this, and we had to agree not to tell Nana about this to avoid scaring her. I recently came across an article about a woman who was hunting and claimed to have seen an invisible or cloaked creature that she likened to the predator from the movie of the same name. I read her story and saw the picture she took of the supposed predator. Regarding the picture, I believe it may be a result of a sun flare and a close-up of her face. However, I am not dismissing her story. In fact, I'm quite doing the opposite, as I also have had a similar encounter that led me to seek out if anybody else has experienced this predator-type creature in the woods. Now, on to my encounter. When I was around 5 years old, I used to play near the woods behind my grandmother's house. I played there frequently, and my grandmother would keep an eye on me from the kitchen or living room, as the house had large windows facing the woods. Every now and then, she would come out and check on what I was doing. I was really into digging in the dirt and collecting unusual rocks and arrowheads scattered around the area where my grandmother lived. This is Midwest Illinois, not far from Cahokia Mounds, so finding arrowheads was not super uncommon. Anyway, that day I remember picking out a spot to dig. I'd been out there for quite some time because I remember I had a decent sized hole going when something caught my eye in the tree I was next to. I don't really know how to explain it, but it looked like a heat wave coming off the branch. It was fall. I remember this because I had my pink jacket on, and I remember thinking that my mom was going to be pissed that I had dirt around the bottom of my arms from digging. I also remember there being a lot of leaves on the ground. Anyway, I am staring at this quote-unquote heat wave and realizing it was somewhat of a human shape. So here I am, 5 years old, and wondering why an invisible man is in the tree. I remember feeling scared but unsure what to do. Then it started moving and making a faint clicking sound. That is when I decided I was not supposed to see this and hightailed it back to the house. My grandmother saw I was pretty shaken, and I remember telling her I had just seen an angel. In my 5-year-old mind, I didn't know what else it could be. I had never seen aliens, heard of ghosts, or monsters at this point. So it really had to be an angel, because that's all my little mind could think of. Fast forward to when I'm about 12 years old or so. By this time, the encounter was way out of my mind. I loved watching action and sci-fi movies. My dad rented a movie called Predator. I'm watching it with him, and the first time you see the Predator invisible/cloaked, I about crapped myself. All the memories from that day, digging in the dirt, came flooding back. I even asked my dad if the Predator was real or not, and if anybody had known any animal that could do something like that. He wasn't really sure, but he told me the Predator thing was definitely fake. It wasn't like today where we could just Google it and figure it all out, you know? I had no access to the internet. So again, I just put it out of my mind. Fast forward to about the year of 2004. I'm grown, have 3 small children, and just went through a separation from my husband. I moved to the next town over to an apartment with my kids. These apartments are all 1-level duplexes and 5 buildings. I am at the very last apartment in the previous building. The apartments are considered in town, but they're more on the outskirts. A deep ditch runs behind the buildings. A chain-link fence separates them from this massive set of woods. There's about 6 or 7 trees on the side of our wall. If you follow the ditch a little bit, you'll hit this small forest that eventually leads to a country road with a bunch of extensive farmland and a bunch more forest and whatnot. I am a smoker, but I would not smoke in the apartment because of the kids, so I often went out onto the back porch. One night I was up late doing laundry and stuff after the kids went to bed. I decided to go outside and take a smoke break before I went to sleep. I am back on the porch and started hearing this faint clicking sound. I immediately looked to the ditch because I had seen a groundhog there a few days before and thought perhaps it was there again. The backyard is dimly illuminated by the nearby playground light to the right of the back porch. I only turned on my porch light when I went out for a quick smoke. I didn't see a groundhog or any movement from the ditch, so I went back to smoking my cigarette. The faint clicking sound kept happening, and a slight movement made me look up into the tree to the left of my porch. Something was there. I didn't see a groundhog or anything like that, but what I did see was vaguely in the shape of a humanoid. It had to have been the same thing that I saw when I was 5. It gave off that same distortion. It was crouched down on the branch with one arm out, holding on to the tree trunk. I couldn't believe it. Is this really happening, is all I could think to myself. Has it come to kill me from seeing it all those years ago? All I could think was about my kids and everybody sleeping in the apartment. I ran inside and slammed the door, locking it immediately. I ran to my kids' rooms and closed all their windows and locked those as well. Then I turned off all the lights in the living room and stared out the blinds at the tree to see if I could catch another glimpse of it. I sat there for what had to be about 10 minutes, maybe even more, and I never saw another thing. I began to think maybe I was just tired, maybe I was just hallucinating it. And just as I was finally talking myself down, my neighbor's dog came running across the yard and started barking at the tree at the same branch where I had seen this predator thing. That freaked me out even more, because that dog was not a barker, and now it kind of reassured what I had just seen. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I have never seen anything like it again, and I don't know if I ever want to. Does anybody listening to this have any idea what it could be? I had a really strange experience last winter at Congaree National Park, just outside of Columbia. It's a beautiful boardwalk that winds through the swamps and cypress forest. If you look at the image, the story might make more sense. I used to live in Columbia, South Carolina, and I often visited the Congaree National Park. also known as the CNP, so I know the area fairly well. I would frequently hop on the fence and walk along the boardwalk at night. It was incredibly peaceful to stroll through the swamp and listen to the sounds of wildlife. There was never a ranger or a guard present after hours, so I was always alone. I went for a walk in October of 2021 with a flashlight. There were lots of insects and frogs making noise, but it suddenly stopped when I was about a mile in. I heard what I thought was my wife call me from the trail ahead, but she wasn't there with me. I was alone, and she was out of town. I then heard water sloshing to my right and saw nothing. I chalked it up to being tired and kept on moving. The wildlife started up shortly, and everything seemed to be fine again. Probably about 15 minutes later, I noticed that it got eerily quiet again, and I heard swamp water sloshing to my left one more time. But this time, it was much more deliberate, almost like somebody walking with purpose. I was in a thick portion of the cypress and couldn't see more than 20 feet in front of me at my best, and then I heard my wife's voice again. Again, she wasn't with me. She was out of town, certainly not moving through a swamp at 1 a.m. I saw what looked like a human silhouette move between the trees for a split second, but it was off. Very skinny, pale, and taller than me at 6 foot. I noped the hell out of there really quickly and ran almost the 2 miles back to my truck and didn't slow down until I heard the wildlife again. Like I said, this is a boardwalk that's in a swamp in the boonies. Nobody is walking around in the dead of night like I am. I'm probably the weirdest person around here. At least, I think so. I feel like I should add that I wasn't high or sleep deprived. I just like going in the woods at night. I was so freaked out by this, I came to the show and had to submit it 100% immediately because I wanted you to hear it. I'm convinced that I have encountered some sort of crawler or wendigo or something else that can mimic voices. Growing up on a small farm bordering a forest in Tennessee, I experienced numerous unexplainable events, but one series of occurrences remains a mystery to this day. When I was around 12 or 13 years old, I began having reoccurring dreams that took place in a forest, a location I often visited. In these dreams, I would come across a large black wolf with glowing red eyes. Strangely, each time I saw this wolf, there would be a death on the farm within a day or two, usually involving a chicken being preyed upon by a predator. During my final dream involving the wolf, a woman's voice accompanied its presence in the forest. I could hear her, but she always remained just out of my line of sight. Though her words are now hazy in my memory, I recall her saying,
"Do not fear the wolf,"
among other things. As the wolf circled me, I didn't feel fear, but rather a deep sense of respect for its ancient power. After that last encounter, I never saw the wolf again, but the dreams felt more vivid than reality. Since then, I've wondered about the identity of the wolf and the woman in the forest. These dreams marked the beginning of my fascination with the paranormal, leading to many more inexplicable experiences. I've often wondered if I connected with a forest spirit or a Native American presence during these encounters.
So I told my story of what I thought was a dogman encounter on this channel a while back. Well, in that video, I stated that I had many weird and crazy stories. Since you graciously shared the last one, I thought why not share another scary encounter I had. As I said in the last video, I lived in Maryland, but before you think of blue crabs and beaches, I'm in a more rural area of the state. My uncle and aunt own a condo, however, at a popular beachcut Ocean City. In late May of 2018, I decided to take my friend Omar to the condo since no one was using it, and I got permission to take the keys and go. It's about a 3-hour drive from my home to Ocean City. And since I was a newer good driver and recently got my provisional license, I decided to drive up for a vacation with my best friend. I own an old black 1970 Chevy Nova, but It is fast as a roadrunner and very reliable. I, extremely hyping up with my new car, decided to purchase a roll cage, which would come into play later in the story. I was told it was stupid and costly, but my family eventually admitted how badass my car looked. Plus, very safe. So on May 28th, I drove my Nova to Omar's house about 5 miles away from mine, and we set off. Depending on which way you go to Ocean City, much of the drive is through farmland and small towns near the Potomac River. We were about 2 hours into the drive, and since it was still midday, we were not pressed for time, seeming how we would be there for about 2 weeks. As Omar snacked on chips loudly, he asked if we could shuffle some music on his phone. My phone was charging on a portable charger in my hoodie pocket, and the speaker was rolling at my feet. Since it was a vintage car, I didn't remove the old speakers or anything, just the stuff I needed since, I needed to fit in the roll cage. I said of course because I and Omar share the same taste in rap music. I picked up the speaker and he connected it via Bluetooth with his phone. Now, since I had a loud engine in the car, the speaker was equally loud to balance out the noise. Omar, of course, blasted the speaker to its max, but I wasn't complaining because the song went hard. While I was too busy rapping to the loud lyrics, I failed to notice the deer standing in the center of the street. Omar yelled for me to swerve, which I did, but as my rear bumper clipped the deer, my car flipped into the air, doing a full corkscrew and landed, sliding on its hood for 12 feet or so. We hung there by our seatbelts in shock, not fully comprehending the insanity of what just unfolded. I had busted my nose and scratched my face pretty bad, and Omar banged his forehead on the dash, but besides that, I'm pretty sure we were all ultimately fine. I looked over at Omar as he looked at me, and we just laughed. Partly because we lived, and mostly because we were in the weird state of nervous shock. It took a minute to compose ourselves, and still strapped in hanging upside down, we began to realize that a damn deer had flipped my car. We somehow got out of my door, crawling painfully through the window, which was shattered all to hell. As Omar stepped out, he met my gaze. I was looking at the same deer standing looking at us as if we had broken a twig. Omar's jaw dropped, as did mine. Maybe it's some metal statue some guy left out as a prank or something, Omar said, but as he did, the deer blinked. Thoroughly freaked out, we started back towards the car, making sure not to break eye contact with the thing. As my thigh bumped into the car, the deer stood up on his back legs and let out a scream that made my head hurt. Omar and I began to run, but knowing we had nowhere to run, we stumbled to the front of my car. But the thing was gone. Out of nowhere, it seemingly just vanished. Our hearts pounding, we tried in vain to flip my precious car. Thankfully, the roll cage I'd invested in not only saved our lives, but most of my car as well. Since flipping it wouldn't work, Omar had a great idea. Call Marco. Our friend Leo's uncle had a towing service, also working in insurance. Remembering the pain that it took to get a company to insure a teen driver like me, I quickly dialed Mr. Romani. He picked up instantly and greeted me like a brother. I shared him our situation, and where the last gas station I saw was, leaving out the detail of a deer creature and replacing it with a hit-and-run driver. His employees were all off, but he told me he could drive us and pick up the car. He took us to the beach and took the car back. I quickly thanked him and asked him to hurry, thinking the beast might still be close. He hung up and we sat back to back on the side of the road. We waited, and it felt like we waited for a very long time. But it only luckily took him about an hour to get to us, because he lived closer to Ocean City than we did. He flipped the car using his truck and tools, and then loaded it on his truck. We hopped in and thanked him. He told me and Omar the car would be fine in his hands, and if we saw the car on the road that flipped us, to point it out. I and Omar glanced at one another and I said I would. The rest of the trip was uneventful. We spent our 2 weeks on the beach and boardwalk, and on our second to last day I got a call from Marco saying all was in order and the car was ready to be dropped off at the condo tomorrow. I told Omar the news and we all breathed a sigh of relief. As the amazing person he was, the work it took to repair my car was cost-free, I thanked him and we hung up. On the drive back, I made sure to take a different route home, while Omar looked up possible explanations of what could have happened. We were so caught up in the joys of vacation that we had barely mentioned it to each other. He found stories of things called skinwalkers, which would manifest and take the shape of creatures. I drove by car much more carefully on the way back, and got us home safely. Although for about 2 weeks after that, there was always a tapping noise on my window. I could have sworn that I heard a voice that sounded like a bad imitation of Omar's voice, whispering as a lure to get me outside. I knew whatever was outside was not my best friend. Some backstory. This was 2 days ago. My family owns about 80 acres of land, and we lease it to my grandfather for his cattle since he has so many. He has about 3 farms that he owns personally, but he needed more space to put his other 20 head of cattle. Now, I'm getting to my story. My grandfather called me at around 8:56 at night, saying that he had lost track of one of the newborn calves and he needed my help. We meet at the old bunkhouse on our property. He said we should split up and search the land, and we took off with our four-wheelers. I drove around the upper, more forested area of the place. I came around and the sun had finally set. It was dark now, so I turned on my lights and drove through the trees. I kept searching for the calf, but I couldn't find it. I stopped my four-wheeler and it was quiet. I pulled out my flashlight and decided to look on foot for a minute. I walked a little bit away from my 4x4 and I heard some light rustling. It was so quiet that I didn't know if I actually heard it or not. I slowly turned my head in the direction and slowly shined my light there. And there it was, the calf. But it was in the lap of, well, something. I can only describe what it looked like because I have no words to name this thing. It was sitting there with the calf in its lap. It had one hand on its back and one in its stomach. Its eyes were huge and it had no pupils. Its head was a skeleton shape, but it was like wrapped in tight skin. You could see the skull inside of its head. Its nose was 2 holes below where they should be. It looked like it didn't even have a mouth, just smooth skin. But there was blood covering the spot where a mouth should have been. We sat there staring at each other for at least 5 minutes. Then, that's when it started opening its mouth, slowly, and its head rolled back. It opened its mouth wide and bent down to its neck. Its teeth were filed and they all curved back towards the throat. It didn't have a tongue, and you could see down its throat. It didn't scream or yell or anything really. It just quietly kind of screeched, and then slowly came back to the state that it was before. I forgot to mention that it was as tall as me sitting. It pulled its hand out of the calf and started standing slowly. I forgot to mention its hands weren't exactly big, but they were long. Its fingers didn't have fingernails, but instead the fingers were sharp points. When it finally stood all the way up, it was an estimated 10 feet tall, and I was about a solid 6 foot. It took a step forward and I finally snapped out of it. I turned and sprinted to the 4x4. As I ran, I looked back and it was following me. But it seemed like it was saying something to me, like it wanted me to stop. And as I thought that, it took 2 strides and it was only 5 feet away from me. I hopped on the 4x4 and was trying to get it to start. I looked back and it was looking down at me. Its sharp claws were coming towards me slowly, as if it were trying to console me while I grieved at a funeral. I started it and took off, and while I was driving over the roar of the engine, I heard quick footsteps behind me. I left the tree line and I rode down the hill and stopped and looked up. It was there looking at me, still the same abstract look on its face. It just walked back into the woods. The day after I came back to that spot I saw the day before, there was a trail of blood that led to a field in the back of the property, and all that was left of the calf was some bones with a little meat in the pile. Right next to it was its skin. I was going to bury it, but I had forgotten to bring a shovel. I left and went to get one, but when I came back, the pelt was hanging from the wall in the bunkhouse. I looked upon the hill, and it was watching me. Last night, when it was really quiet, and I was close to being asleep, I heard some twigs snapping outside my house. I looked out the window from the blinds and I saw a pair of white eyes staring back at me.
Thanks for listening to these creepy and downright strange cryptid encounter horror stories that'll freak you out tonight. If you enjoyed these stories, please be sure to slap that like button silly, as it helps me out a ton. The more likes this episode gets, the more YouTube promotes it to fresh new faces, and that helps the swamp grow its ever-expanding waters. If you have a story that you would like to share in a future episode, whether it's an encounter with some sort of skinwalker, a dogman, a Bigfoot, or anything in between, be sure to submit your story at swampdweller.net, or the email you can find in the description down below. I would love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp. It's stories like yours that help keep this show going on a daily basis. If you're on the go but don't have YouTube Premium but still want to download and listen to your favorite Swamp Dweller scary stories no matter where you are, you can download them absolutely free from Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and pretty much everywhere else you find your favorite podcast online. Thank you guys so much for supporting the swamp the way you do. I couldn't do this without you guys. Be sure to go join me over on X or Twitter or whatever you want to call it, Instagram, for some fun memes and updates, and all the other fun social medias out there. I'm always posting and sharing stuff on those websites. I'll see you all soon with another creepy episode.